The last of six threads that comprise this market revolution is manufacturing. And you don't have a lot of manufacturing, even during the market revolution. You do see some heavy industry, basically iron manufacturing, beginning of some steel manufacturing. But the first um, major manufacturing in this country is the textile industry. And of course, it's driven in considerable measure by the availability of a lot of short strand cotton. If you look at cotton spinning, factories that are doing this kind of thing in 1810, you can see that there's very little of it anywhere in the country. And what there is located in New England, particularly in Massachusetts and Connecticut. If you look at uh, the same industry 30 years later, you can see that there are textile mills, um, not just in the Northeast now, but also parts of the South. But in the South, it's done on a small scale. In New England, though, it's being done on a much larger scale. And indeed, this is where New England is where industrialization first makes its appearance. Okay. Now, why is this? Well, New England, a lot of the soil is kind of poor and rocky and not really good for agriculture. But what New England does have going for it is a lot of wealth, from the merchant shipping trade, and so that's available to be invested. It's also true that in New England, um, the rivers reach what's called the fall line relatively close to where they empty out into the Atlantic Ocean. And the fall line is the point really where um, the the river sort of broadens out and begins to move more slowly. But the fall line is called that because there are literally waterfalls at that point in the river, and the waterfalls in New England, were close to urban areas already, and and towns got built up around these waterfalls as you had factories that got built that used water power um, to to drive the manufacturing process, the giant looms that they use, other kinds of things. And the textile mills really got off to a good start, in part because after the war with England, all that those problems in the early parts of the 19th century cut off the traditional British market, for textiles for a while. That gave New England textile mills a bit of a leg up. The availability of short strand cotton gave them a leg up, and the protective tariff um, also, gave them a competitive advantage they would not otherwise have. Now you're looking here at the Lowell Textile Mills Complex. It's in Lowell, Massachusetts. It's not that the Textile Mills Complex is named for Lowell. It's that Lowell is named for the Textile Mills Complex. The owner of the Textile Mills Complex was named Francis Cabot Lowell. Now, his Boston Manufacturing Company overall introduced the first successful American power loom and built the world's first self-sufficient textile plant that brought all the steps in cotton cloth production under one roof. And as these factories spread, what you begin to see is a decline in skilled labor, the need for skilled labor, and an increase in unskilled labor. That what you would do, and we'll look at this some more, is you would divide the manufacturing process into different parts, and these different parts are so simple that you didn't within a few hours you could train the person to do the job, and if they gave you any trouble, could get rid of them. McDonald's nowadays for is an example of this. There was a time when even in a diner, something like that, you had skilled labor in the form of a cook who could handle all aspects of cooking meals and preparation for meals, and could keep track of different meals that were being prepared at the same time. That was skilled labor. Well, what McDonald's did, but it divided the process of making food into parts that any teenager could come into a McDonald's, and within a couple of hours could basically learn one part of the job, and then if they stayed longer, they could learn the other parts. But you know, you work but if you work at a McDonald's, there are real limits on what you're going to get paid, because you might work very hard at it, but your labor is by design kept unskilled. That's the way that that McDonald's operates. That's the way that a lot of manufacturing operates. It commodifies labor. And Lowell's cotton mills, were the first. Textile mills were really the first to kind of begin to sort of perfect this business of taking away the need for skilled labor and replacing it with relatively unskilled labor. Now, there was also this thing specifically called the Lowell system. And what Lowell liked to do was to employ unmarried Yankee farm girls, as it were, in their, girls in their late teens, early 20s, young women, late teens, early 20s. And they lived on the grounds of the textile mills. It was a whole, not only did you have the factories there, you also had dormitories there. And and the conditions in which they lived were comfortable, but at the same time tightly regulated. And if you look here, the timetable of the Lowell mills, you can see that you're looking at the months, but if you look across the top, you see that there's a first bell, second bell, third bell, eve bell, and so forth. But these are divisions in the shifts that these women are working. And if you look down, you'll see that the yard gates will be opened, the ringing of the last morning bell, meal bells, evening bells, and kept open for 10 minutes. So if you want to get to your job without being penalized, that gate's going to be open for 10 minutes. You need to get in there in 10 minutes. If you want a meal, gate's going to be open for 10 minutes, and so on. Okay. So there's times when the mill gates open. There's times when work commences. There's times when when the breakfast bells ring out, dinner bells, and so forth. And then so what you're talking about is a very regimented life. Well, this kind of regimentation and being able to keep track of time and so forth, really influenced public education. And we'll look at the rise of public education in lecture presentation on reform movements that came along at the same time as the market revolution. But one of the things that public education did, in addition to teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic and so forth, it also indoctrinated children to hold values that factory employers wanted, a sense of time. So living life by the clock became important. Punctuality, being on time, was important. Obedience to authority was important, and so on. And so American classrooms, did all of these things in a sort of a implicit way. It wasn't like kids were actually little kids were taught the value of discipline and punctuality and so forth, but it was also just embedded into the way in which public education operated. And of course, if you're having a traditional classroom experience, the class begins at a certain time, ends at a certain time. You're expected to sort of be quiet while the professor's lecturing, if that's the way things things work, and so on. So these industrial values or whatever permeated education then, and continue to be involved with education now. Next thing, because of this commodification of labor, that skilled labor became less necessary, because you could sort of take the process of making things breaking it down into parts, Um, so that rather than a cobbler making, a shoe from scratch or what have you, you could have a person making, this small part of a shoe and that small part and so on. And it didn't take much skill to put together like one part of this shoe as it did to do the entire thing. So a lot of times men no longer learned a skill, they were no longer cobblers, but again, employed in making one part of a shoe that was then assembled. And the construction of turnpikes, railroads, and canals did not really require skilled labor either. And what and the result of this is that white laborers, and on the left you see, canal laborers specifically around 1850, they began to fear that their status was becoming no different from that of enslaved Americans. And you can see on the right, you can see African American longshoremen in 1865. They actually are working for the Union Army, in a logistics capacity, loading and unloading ships that had supplies for the Union Army. And so, in self-defense, though, these white laborers um, began to really emphasize, you know, the color of their skin, you know, um, and argued really successfully that hey, you can push, you know, a black man to do this kind of work and to work these long hours and so forth and to treat them in a certain kind of way, but you can't treat me that way because I'm a white man. You know? And so this gave a kind of a different spin to something that already existed for a long period of time, white racism. And it is one of the reasons why people who in terms of racial hostility, which is really there's a real uptick of this after the American Revolution. The people who hated African Americans most ferociously were poor whites, who were just very slightly above them on the economic ladder, but really wanted to stay there. We'll talk more about the importance of being white in American society, particularly Southern society, down the line. Uh, and so, they enjoyed. They might not be getting paid very much at all, but they enjoyed what historians have called a psychological wage. So that, however modest their income, they were at least better off than African Americans. Uh, and one historian, wrote actually a pretty influential book about this. The title was "The Wages of Whiteness," and he had a pretty good point going on there. Now, finally, in terms of the social impact of the market revolution, you do see commodification of labor. Industrial labor began to be seen as interchangeable, and this is going to become an even greater problem for laborers when you get to the Industrial Revolution. And in self-defense, they're going to create labor unions, but that begins to happen on a small scale. It's going to happen on a major scale when we get to the Industrial Revolution. But it is a reaction to this intentional commodification of labor. And by the way, what I mean by a commodity, wheat is a commodity. One grain of wheat looks it's the same as another grain of wheat. It's the same as another one. Same thing with corn. Same thing with frozen concentrated orange juice and so forth. These are all commodities. Again, the wages of whiteness crops up during this period. Laborers emphasize their whiteness as a protection against being treated like slaves. And so this becomes an important component of American race relations. We'll talk about that more down the line. Uh, and uh, and then you get the cult of true womanhood. And what goes on in urban middle class homes, economic activity, on the part of men in the middle class, the men went off to work. They weren't working in factories. That was what laborers were doing, but they would be working as clerks and as accountants and other kinds of roles that anybody who owned a factory, would need. And these people were relatively skilled, but they were now working outside the home. And once upon a time, it had been, when you're working on farms, everybody worked together. So husbands and wives worked alongside each other to make, to make the farm go. Same thing with children. But in these urban middle class homes, economic activity got divorced from the household. Father went off to work, mom stayed home, and this placed an emphasis on women as homemakers and mothers and as the member of the family that created um, sort of a nice home life, a pleasant home life, for everybody. Um, and and then, of course, men began to be seen as breadwinners. So this sounds like a pretty modern phenomenon, and and really, it became sort of an ideal that um, during the 19th century was called the cult of true womanhood, but that continued well into the 20th century, and it had the effect of excluding women from having careers outside the home, and even in colleges. Um, During the 1950s, it was common to speak of female students pursuing their MRS degree, which is to say they were in college, but mainly to find a man who would become their husband. And this was considered to be kind of an ideal, to be what my mother called a professional homemaker. That is what she did. Um, During the night, but then the ground shifted out from under her because, being able to not work and to be a full-time mother and a full-time homemaker, that was considered to be a good thing. Um, you know, from the mid 19th century on to the mid 20th century. Then, in the 1960s and 1970s, you get sort of second wave, feminism and sort of, the pushing by women to have careers outside the home and an emphasis placed on that. And you're no longer going to college to find yourself a man. You're going to college to get an education, to have a career of your own. So, but again, this sort of traditional view of the role of wives and so on, is an artifact itself of the market revolution. A few more comments and I'm done with this. By 1830, as early as 1830, the new economy. I'm going to take this down really. I don't need to share the screen anymore. There we go. Okay. Even by 1830, this new economy had taken off in a big way, but the accompanying changes could be very disturbing. To begin with, some people benefited from this new prosperity more than others, so that from the standpoint of personal wealth, the gulf between rich and poor actually widened. Those who benefited most, merchants and manufacturers, lawyers and other professionals, the most successful commercial farmers, particularly planters, which by definition were um, farmers who owned or enslaved 20 or more people. Um, they benefited from this new economy. Um, and the new wealth that they had was, it was definitely nice to have. It was what they were working for. It was what they got, but it was also, unsettling because it was part of a larger society that was getting unsettled by all of this. Uh, Only about 14% of Americans during this period lived in cities, but in urban areas, the creation of more manufacturing, trade houses, offices, and so on meant, to repeat a point, that economic life increasingly took place away from family life. And inevitably, it became more impersonal as older patterns of economic activity among family and neighbors gave way to purely business transactions between strangers. And just as the older conservatives feared, what was going to happen is that human relationships were going to be mediated through money to an increasing degree, and that is exactly what happened. So, and so for all Americans, the market revolution made life seem much more competitive. And there was a sense of kind of root hog or die. And a question arose. Should this naked economic activity be allowed to control so much of human life? And the response to that was the reform movements uh, that emerged at the same time as the market revolution. And we'll look at those in another lecture.